They arrive again in Jerusalem, and while Jesus was walking in the temple courts, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders came to him. "By what authority are you doing these things?" they asked. "And who gave you authority to do this?" Jesus replied, "I'll ask you one question. Answer me, and I will tell you by what authority I'm doing these things. John's baptism, was it from heaven or was it from men? Tell me." They discussed it among themselves and said, "If we say from heaven, he'll ask then, 'Why didn't you believe him?' But if we say from men," they feared the people, for everyone held that John was a prophet. So they answered Jesus, "We don't know." And Jesus said, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I'm doing these things." This is my favorite Jesus when he's like playing the Batman's Riddler. That's my favorite Jesus, when he says, "Riddle me this. John's baptism, was it from heaven or was it from men? If you tell me, then I'll answer your question." Now, the funny thing is, when you're trying to trap somebody, there's always this secondary thing going on. When you're trying to prove a point, you're not asking in good faith. When you're not acting in good faith, there's always a secondary motivation. And so when he says, "Tell me, answer my riddle, answer my question," and they have to really weigh. They don't answer from their heart, right? They're not responding in good faith. They have to say, "Well, if we say this, then this will happen. But if we go this way, then the people will revolt." So they have analysis paralysis, as we say. They don't know what to say, so they say, "Well, we don't know." And Jesus says, "Then I'm not going to answer your question." This is my favorite Jesus, the Riddler. He's a very shifty, sort of wily character. And I always like to think, if we were casting for a movie, who would get to play Jesus? And some of my favorite suggestions are I love Danny DeVito. I just think he'd be an interesting Jesus, A lot of people go for Charlton Heston, but that's more of a Moses thing, right? I think Jesus is a little more wiry. Christopher Walken, to me, would be a great Jesus. But in this situation, I really do, when I read this, it sounds like Johnny Depp to me. This is more of that, that quirky, sort of shifty thing. Jesus had a very elusive, when they were pressing in on him and trying to trick him, he says, "Well, why don't you answer my question and then I'll answer your question." And they couldn't. He says, "Well, then I'm not going to tell you." I wanted to make it all the way through one chapter. By the way, some of you are like, "I've never read a whole chapter of the Bible in one sitting in my entire life." So congratulations, well done. We did it. The reason that I wanted to do a whole chapter is I wanted you to see Mark's storytelling, that he brings us in through this political protest, sort of mocking pageant thing, this carnival atmosphere. He brings us through the temple. He walks us out to do this prophetic act, almost like a performance art with the fig tree. He has this confrontation with the religious leaders. And in the ebb and flow, you see that these aren't just standalone vignettes that don't tie together. Mark is actually starting to show us why Jesus ends up dead at the end of our story. So I just want to touch on something today, because as we continue through this series in July and August, we'll be done by the end of August, and then we'll start something new for kickoff in September. I just want to say that when people miss the context of both the story that the first century church, the audience would have understood, but also the way that Mark is portraying the story, there's something really significant that can happen behind the scenes, which is that people begin to say things like, in our time, people say that Jesus died for our sins. And that's a really dangerous thing to say if you mean that because I did something bad, God had to take out his anger on Jesus so that God could be pleased with me. That's really dangerous stuff. It's more accurate to say that Not that Jesus died for our sins, but some people say things like Jesus died because of our sins, which is a little better, but not super clear yet. I like it when people say Jesus died to expose humanity's sinfulness or our sins. I just think we need to be careful and listen to what Mark is telling us. Jesus didn't die because of our sins or for our sins, as much as Jesus died because the sinfulness of the systems, both political and religious and economic, that humanity has set up kills people who speak truth to power. It kills prophets. Even in the 20th century, we saw this. So Jesus didn't die for our sins, but he did die because of our sins. And he died to expose the sinfulness of the systems that humanity has set up and then has fallen prisoner to. Something to think on. I'm going to give you a moment to reflect. If you're using the sermon notes, there's a place down here you can write your questions. If you want that question to get to me, you can drop it in the offering plate, and it'll make its way to me this week. But I'd like you to just sit with what you've heard as we prepare to come to the table together. And I'm going to ask Jan if she will meet me to help me serve communion.